This is the BBC. For details of our complete range of programmes, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Welcome to the latest global news compiled in the early hours of Monday the 25th of December. I'm Jackie Leonard with a selection of highlights from across BBC World Service News today. Coming up, the Russian politician Alexei Navalny tells crowds in Moscow he's a viable alternative to President Putin.
Мы готовы и выиграем эти выборы.
We are ready to win these elections and we will win. This year we've seen that Putin does not have mass support.
Also in this podcast, the King of Spain has pleaded for national unity and called for an end to confrontation in Catalonia in his Christmas message to the Spanish people. North Korea reacts to the latest UN sanctions.
We define this sanctions resolution, rigged by the US and its followers, as a grave infringement upon the sovereignty of our republic and as an act of war.
And later... Christians in Mosul are celebrating Christmas for the first time since the Islamic State group was defeated in July. But first, supporters of the Russian opposition politician Alexei Navalny have been gathering in cities across Russia to express support for his bid to run in the presidential election in March. Mr. Navalny said the backing he'd received showed he was a viable alternative to President Putin.
Мы готовы и выиграем эти выборы.
We are ready to win these elections and we will win. I say this without irony. This year we've seen that Putin does not have mass support anywhere. Even with all his resources, even with all the constant lies on television, he has no support. There's just melancholy and emptiness.
Our Moscow correspondent Sarah Rainsford has been following developments.
Well, this was the very first official step in the process towards launching an election campaign, basically, Alexei Navalny trying to run for president. So what he needed was 500 people to come out and sign up to support him and for that to be recognised by a notary. And so he called people to come out onto the streets and into buildings across the country in multiple cities. But in fact, here in Moscow, he had more than 700 people who came out into a giant tent on a river beach in the snow just outside the city centre here in Moscow, and they were enough to give him the number of supporters that he needs to move this process forward. So he's now submitting those signatures to the central electoral authorities here, and they then have 5 days to consider whether or not to allow him to pass to the next stage of the race. But in fact, they've already said in the past that because he has a suspended criminal conviction, a sentence for fraud, which he says is politically motivated, they've already said that he won't actually be allowed to run for president. So this looks like the first step, possibly the last step of the official process for him.
But he is suggesting that if he's not allowed to stand, that people should boycott the vote, isn't he?
Well, that's right. He's not going to go down without a massive fight, and that's precisely what he's trying to do. He's trying to force the authorities to register him just by showing them how much support he has. And that's why, actually, for the past year, he's basically been running an electoral campaign. He's been travelling to cities and meeting voters and supporters on city squares right across the country, which is really quite extraordinary here in Russia. It doesn't really happen like that in this country, and it's got him into trouble with the authorities. He's been detained a number of times, and so have his supporters. But it has shown that he does have a degree of support. Now, he claims that if it were a fair race between him and Vladimir Putin, he'd have a very good chance of being elected president. Now, President Putin, of course, his polls show that he supposedly has some 80% support, and he certainly is very popular still here in Russia. But I think the problem is, as Alexei Navalny points out, there isn't really a fair electoral process here. So at the moment, it's really unclear who exactly supports whom.
Sarah Rainsford in Moscow. The King of Spain has used his Christmas message to issue a call for national unity. Felipe VI called on the people of Catalonia to choose coexistence rather than confrontation. Our Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly listened to the broadcast.
Felipe VI's last televised speech in October angered many Catalans because he criticised the leaders of the independence movement who organised the unlawful referendum rather than the Spanish police who heavy-handedly tried to block it. His core underlying message about the importance of national unity for Spain remains unchanged, but his Christmas broadcast was more cautious and more conciliatory.
Hace unos días, los ciudadanos de Cataluña han votado para elegir a sus representantes en el Parlamento.
He said the politicians elected to the Catalan parliament this week which now includes a narrow separatist majority, had to find a way to address the region's problems which would lead to coexistence rather than confrontation. He was careful to praise what he called Catalonia's openness and creative spirit. Felipe VI is a constitutional monarch, and there was never any prospect that he would offer a solution to the constitutional crisis over Catalonia. His advisers, though, will probably feel at a minimum that he's done nothing to make things worse. The leader of the bloc of separatist parties which won a majority in Thursday's election, Carlos Puigdemont, remains in Brussels, a fugitive from the Spanish judicial authorities. He has called on the Spanish Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy to meet him, a call to which Mr. Rajoy clearly has no intention of responding.
That was Kevin Connolly in Madrid. The United Nations has described as dire the humanitarian crisis facing the southern Philippines. More than 200 people have died as a result of tropical storm Tembin, and on the island of Mindanao, flooding and landslides have left tens of thousands homeless. Pope Francis has said he's praying for the victims. Howard Johnson is monitoring developments from the Philippine capital, Manila.
High winds and heavy rain have battered Mindanao for the last 3 days as tropical storm Tembin has made its way across the country. Rivers burst their banks, inundating towns, and some villages were buried under landslides. Vic Ma has been leading a rescue team.
There were 103 sana na mga houses.
There used to be 103 houses here, but when the flash flood happened, everything was washed out. All their homes and livelihoods gone.
The Philippines National Disaster Council is spearheading the relief effort, providing meals and shelter to thousands of people displaced by the storm. Lotta Silwanda speaks for the United Nations Children's Fund UNICEF in the country. She said many people have been left without clean water or electricity.
It is a really dire situation, and I think the most important thing right now is really to get to people and start with life-saving sort of inputs, really just keep them alive, keep them from getting different kinds of diseases at this stage.
The Philippines is hit by around 20 typhoons every year, bringing misery to some of the poorest communities in the country. Storm Tembin has now passed the Philippines and has strengthened to typhoon status. It's currently moving over the South China Sea and is expected to hit Vietnam in the coming days.
Howard Johnson reporting. North Korea has described the latest UN sanctions as an act of war. The UN Security Council unanimously imposed new sanctions on the North in response to its recent intercontinental ballistic missile test. The resolution seeks to ban nearly 90% of refined oil imports and demands the repatriation of North Koreans working abroad within 2 years. A statement by the North Korean Foreign Ministry was read on state-run television.
We define this sanctions resolution, rigged by the U.S. and its followers, as a grave infringement upon the sovereignty of our republic and as an act of war, violating peace and stability in the Korean peninsula and the region. We also categorically reject the resolution.
So how does that reaction compare with the way in which North Korea has responded in the past to UN sanctions? A question the BBC's Julian Marshall put to Jean Lee, who used to be the Associated Press bureau chief in Pyongyang and is now a global fellow with the Wilson Center.
We're accustomed to hearing this type of belligerence from North Korea, so it's not surprising. That said, to call it an act of war, we've heard that phrase in the past before, but the timing of it, of course, is very worrying. It does raise the question of whether they're setting up for another provocation. And I have to tell you, I'm speaking to you from South Korea, and what South Koreans are most concerned about is another provocation less than 2 months before they host a Winter Olympics. The North Koreans are very well aware that there's a window of time here where they can wreak havoc. But, there's also looking at the language. They are very unhappy that Russia and China have signed on to these sanctions. And they're very unhappy that these sanctions include a further cap on their ability to access refined petroleum. They're calling this an economic blockade. And so they're using all of that as perhaps justification for another provocation.
But can we take it, though, from the reaction that there is an acknowledgement by North Korea that these latest sanctions might hurt?
There is definitely some shades of that acknowledgement. But I think also we should keep in mind that this type of response is to be expected and that they will incorporate the sanctions into their propaganda. What they'll do is tell their people, by using this type of tough language and specifically targeting the United States or naming the United States, they will tell their people that this is a continuation of this U.S. policy that's designed to suppress North Korea. And they characterize this as unfair, and that's why they call it an act of war, when in fact, of course, as we all know in the rest of the world, this is a direct response to North Korea's defiance against UN orders to stop testing nuclear devices and ballistic missiles. But the North Koreans don't know that. They're just going to be told this is yet another act of aggression by the United States. And the only way that we can stop military strike or military aggression from the U.S. is to fight back by defending ourselves, building up our nuclear program.
What would you expect, though, the consequences of those sanctions to be inside North Korea, especially that restriction on oil imports?
We should keep in mind that sanctions are only good as long as they're enforced. UN sanctions are not binding, so it's really up to each of the member states to honor them and to enforce them. So we've had numerous sanctions placed upon North Korea, and yet we've seen very little of those sanctions enforced. That said, I can tell you from speaking to North Koreans, and I was there earlier this year, that a fuel blockade is something that they were very worried about. The working people of Pyongyang are aware that their country's relationship with China is not good right now. And that was one of the things that they were very concerned about. Do you think China is going to stop sending fuel? Now, I should point out that they didn't sign on to a complete blockade. And that is because China and Russia, they want to sting North Korea, but they don't want to trigger a humanitarian crisis.
Just picking up, though, on a point from your first answer, you are saying that there is an expectation in the south that there might soon be yet another ballistic missile test by the North?
They certainly don't want one. So there's a lot of concern and hand-wringing here in South Korea that these tensions are going to disrupt the games. They start on February 9th, so it's just right around the corner. And certainly they're doing what they can to try to maintain some sense of calm. North Korea is very well aware of this. They know they have this window of time where the world will be watching the Korean Peninsula.
Jean Lee. In Turkey, thousands of public employees were sacked in the aftermath of the failed coup in July last year. A further round of dismissals has just been announced in the country's official newspaper. But in a speech on Sunday, the Turkish Prime Minister Binali Yildirim announced plans to take on more public sector staff over the coming year. Our Europe regional editor, Mike Sanders, reports.
The hiring plan goes a little more than two-thirds of the way to addressing the staff shortages that have built up since the coup attempt. Around 150,000 people have been sacked or suspended since then. Schools especially have been affected, hence the provision for 20,000 new teachers next year. But it's been tough for the old guard. Most of those sacked were accused of links to Fethullah Gulen, the US-based Muslim cleric who's vehemently denied the government's persistent claim that he was behind the coup. Mr. Gulen says his Hizmet, or service movement, promotes modern education, interfaith dialogue and faith-based activism. His opponents say it's been infiltrating the police, army and judiciary for years. But as there's no formal membership, it's difficult to prove an individual's involvement or for that person to refute it. Those sacked will never get a job in the public sector, and the stigma of association with the coup attempt, no matter how unfounded, makes it difficult to find employment elsewhere. Just this week, a kind of appeals panel has begun reinstating some of those sacked, but just 115 people so far.
That was Mike Sanders. For the second time in 17 years, a far-right party is part of the governing coalition in Austria. When the anti-immigrant Eurosceptic Freedom Party last entered government in 2000, the European Union showed its displeasure by imposing sanctions. This time, reaction has been more muted, a measure of how much politics in Europe has shifted to the right. The Freedom Party, or FPO, which gained 26% of the vote, is the junior partner in the coalition, but it has secured some key posts, including the Interior, Defence and Foreign Ministries, as Bethany Bell reports from Vienna.
The leader of Austria's Freedom Party, Heinz Christian Strache, in characteristically fiery mood. His party is riding high. Unlike many far-right movements in Europe, it's moved from opposition to real political power. It's controversial. The party was founded by former Nazis in the 1950s and routinely has to expel or suspend members who veer towards neo-Nazi ideology. But the Freedom Party politician Andreas Rabel told me people shouldn't be scared. He strongly rejects claims that his party is an extreme right movement.
I can't understand that. In no way. We are a right-wing party, it's true. We are also a homeland party, that is true too. But we stand by European values. We stand for democracy and we stand for human rights. And I can't understand where this fear comes from. It must be because of misinformation.
Das kann nur auf Fehlinformationen beruhen.
Immer wieder Österreich, Austria again and again, the Freedom Party's anthem. The party has been a significant player in Austria for decades, but it had a surge in support during Europe's migrant crisis in 2015, with its anti-foreigner, anti-Muslim message. Austria's new leader, Sebastian Kurz of the Conservatives, denies charges that he's normalising the far right. He says the coalition is based on EU values.
The most important thing is that we are a pro-European country and that our government is pro-European. Like in other countries, we have the situation that we have to build coalitions. The Social Democrats in our country decided not to join a coalition with us, and so we had to build a coalition with the Freedom Party.
Well, this is one of Vienna's famous Christmas markets. Lots of little wooden stalls selling handicrafts and gingerbread. And there are a lot of people running around buying Christmas presents. Others, though, are gathered around the mulled wine stall. And that's where I met Anton, who works at a nearby bank. He told me that he's really not worried about the prospect of the Freedom Party in government.
I think the FPÖ under Strache in the past 10 years has shown us that they are also pro-European, and they should have the chance to show that they are not a right extreme party and also European, liberal European party.
But others are deeply concerned. Clara is a law student at Vienna University.
I'm very worried what the world will think about us, and I just hope maybe we don't have this coalition for so long, so afterwards maybe something better will come and the people will realize that it wasn't good, and yeah.
That report was by Bethany Bell in Vienna. You're listening to Global News, the most important stories and the best interviews and on-the-spot reporting from the BBC World Service. Now here's Owen Bennett-Jones to tell you about another of our podcasts.
Our brand new podcast series, The Assassination, is about an unsolved murder with global ramifications. It's an investigation into the assassination of one of the world's most prominent politicians, Pakistan's Benazir Bhutto. Subscribe now and you won't miss episode 1. Search for The Assassination where you get your podcasts.
And still to come in this edition of the Global News podcast. An unusual New Year's ritual in Osaka, Japan. More on that a little later. But first, Christmas is being celebrated in the Iraqi city of Mosul for the first time in 4 years. Christian families have been returning following the defeat of the Islamic State group there in July. This report is by our Middle East analyst, Alan Johnston.
Dozens of worshippers gathered in Mosul's cathedral amid flickering candles and Christmas decorations. In the battered city, this was a coming together not just of Christians, but of Muslims too, as the Chaldean Catholic Patriarch Louis Sacco explained.
It was like a miracle. The people who prepared the church, they were young Muslims from the city. But the church was full of Christians and Muslims together, praying and asking for peace.
The Patriarch said the message was that people were weary of war, that there needed to be a change of mentality, a new respect for one another. The service was one more small sign of a return to normality in Mosul, but there were also reminders of the conflict and the continuing tensions. Above the worshippers, drapes covered the frames of stained glass windows that were blown out during the fighting. And outside, on the approaches to the cathedral, there was a heavy protective security presence, including armoured cars.
Alan Johnston. Like cleaning the Egyptian sphinxes with a toothbrush. That's how Pope Francis has described the process of reforming the Vatican as he concludes his 5th year as pontiff. In his Christmas address to Vatican staff, Pope Francis took the opportunity to dress down the officials, urging them to examine their consciences over the festive season, as he warned of plots and cliques within Rome. Our Vatican correspondent David Willey told us more.
The Pope at Christmas time, he uses his Christmas meeting with the cardinals who run the headquarters of the Catholic Church in Rome to tick them off for all sorts of delinquencies. This year he denounced what he called the cancer of factions. He described the attempts to reform the Roman Curia, which is the name given to the central administration of the Catholic Church, as he said, like cleaning the Egyptian sphinxes with a toothbrush.
And was there any indication of whom he was referring to and what sorts of factions, plots, cliques perhaps he was talking about?
Well, everybody knows that there's a group of cardinals in the headquarters of the Church who don't share his shall we say, more enlightened views. There's always a problem on reporting the Vatican. How do you describe these people in the Church? Some people describe them as traditionalists, others as right-wingers. Certainly the American bishops and cardinals do tend towards right-wing views. But I think the Pope is trying his best to get away from giving political labels to church dignitaries. Pope Francis, coming from the outside, he described himself as coming from the ends of the earth when you may remember when he was elected, has found it rather difficult.
As you say, Francis does not always see eye to eye with the Curia. How much progress would you say he's actually making in the reforms that he wants to bring in?
I think it's pretty slow. Every 3 months, he meets with a group of 9 cardinals who he appointed right at the start of his reign to help him govern the church. These were outsiders who he called in to give him advice. And they've been labouring away all the several years now, trying to write a new constitution for the Vatican. Not as easy as they first thought, which I think the Pope has found it difficult. And I think he's a very kindly man. When he was elected, he knew he had to, as it were, clean out the stables. He's been very delicate in the way he's tried to gradually substitute people with his own mindset rather than the traditional mindsets of the Catholic Church.
That was David Willey, our Vatican correspondent. Inequality in Brazil remains a serious problem, and it means that opportunities for people living in the country's slums or favelas are often very limited. But there's one recent initiative that's transformed one neighbourhood of Brazil's biggest city, Sao Paulo, as Katie Watson reports.
Today's repertoire includes Pink Panther. This is the Baccarelli Institute, a music training organisation in Heliópolis, one of Sao Paulo's favelas. It opened more than 20 years ago after a huge fire in the slum. Musician Silvio Baccarelli wanted to do something to help the families. It's grown from 36 students to over 1,000. Now there are 5 orchestras, 16 infant choirs and more than 20 music groups. All of the pupils are from the local area. The neighbourhood of Heliópolis is one of Sao Paulo's biggest favelas, but it's also one of the more formalised now. It's got tarmac for roads, but you can see the unplanned nature of this neighbourhood, how it started with very simple houses, one storey built on top of the other without much planning. And the houses are very simple structures, higgledy-piggledy and small winding roads, and towering over the neighbourhood you can see in the distance some smart apartment blocks. 19-year-old Juan Rodriguez lives in Heliópolis with his parents and 2 siblings. He's been playing the cello since he was 8. He was a keen footballer too, but he stopped kicking a ball to pursue music.
It's all down to my parents saying this is the path you should follow, because you're in charge of your own destiny. You can succeed and you don't need anyone else to do it. I made that decision at the age of 14 or 15. I had to quit football. I carried on, and it's a source of pride to have a cellist in our family. It's not something we were used to.
It's not easy, though. Brazil's gone through an economic crisis that's hit companies hard. The Institute has recently lost 2 big sponsors. Ahead of the elections in October, Ed Milson says culture's become political.
Nowadays in Brazil, people think that encouraging culture is throwing money away, giving it to some errant artist. This is exactly what our politicians are trying to say. But culture will prevail, and those people will move on.
As the orchestra practices its Christmas numbers, they try to forget about uncertain times, focus on the festivities, and think about the future later.
That report was by Katie Watson in Sao Paulo, and extra points for using the phrase higgledy-piggledy. And finally, at the moment, many are focusing on Christmas celebrations. In Japan, though, some people are already looking ahead to the new year. Not with champagne or fireworks, they have instead an entirely different way of saying out with the old, in with the new, as Riley Carlson explains.
It's a New Year's ritual in Osaka, Japan, filing into this shrine looking for a fresh start. Here they follow the chief priest. And then, on his cue, this is a laughing ceremony to forget the bad they've experienced throughout the year.
I laughed all the bad things away. I hope next year will be filled with laughter.
The ritual is based on a Japanese myth that says laughter opened the cave of the sun goddess. The priests keep them going for about 20 minutes. It spreads throughout the temple. Laughter is contagious, as they say. And here in Japan, so is the hope of a happier new year.
Riley Carlson reporting. And that's it from us for now, but I will be back with a special and I hope uplifting edition of the Global News podcast a little later. If you'd like to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, do please send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Jackie Leonard, and until next time, if you're celebrating, Merry Christmas.